The glory of humanity is the differentiation, individuality of each person, and the fact that each individual is unique and irreplaceable, which makes each individual precious.
I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about two classes of Americans, and it may not be the two classes you think of, but nonetheless, there are two distinct classes in America, and we have to break up.
You don't get freedom peacefully. Anyone who is depriving you of freedom isn't deserving of a peaceful approach.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being by any means necessary.
Welcome to the Unrestrained Thoughts Podcast, a Utah-based program that focuses on ideas, politics, culture, and the current events going on in the world around us, whether locally or globally. I'm your host, David Iglesias. Awesome. Okay. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Unrestrained Thoughts Podcast. Today is another great guest. We have Connor Boyack. How are you doing, Connor?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for taking the time to do this. You wear a lot of different hats, and you are kind of a well-known figure within, the liberty circles and just Utah politics in general, I'd say. I mean, you've first and foremost, you're a father and a husband, the most important roles. Sorry, these things popping up. And then you're also the president of the Libertas Institute, which is a think tank, a nonprofit think tank for the state of Utah, helping to make sure that certain policies are geared towards protecting people's, or not infringing people's personal liberties. But you're also an author and the brains behind the Tuttle Twins. And you actually just released a new history book for the Tuttle Twins. You want to maybe right at the top of this, since we've got everyone's attention at the beginning, talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Tuttle Twins is a series of children's books that teach the ideas of a free society to the rising generation. Ideas that, should theoretically be taught in school. Once upon a time, were taught in school, now no longer are. If anything, quite opposite ideas are being taught, victimhood and gender identity and that capitalism is oppression and all these types of things. So the Tuttle Twins is basically a way for parents to make sure their kids' heads are, put on straight and they learn actual truth and sound ideas. The history book, I'm actually sitting here at a desk where I've got this pile of history books next to me, like these massive, textbooks that you remember carrying around when you were 10 years old and you had a backpack full of these like massive textbooks that are huge. And about 2.5 years ago, I bought a bunch of these books trying to understand, all right, how is it? I mean, American history is rich with the ideas of liberty and, self-sovereignty and classical liberalism, property rights, pursuit of happiness, and all the rest. So I'm like, all right, let's figure out how this stuff is being taught to kids today. So I bought a whole bunch of these books, many of which I have here next to me right now. And I start flipping through these books trying to say, how do they teach about the Constitution, the Revolution, colonization, and so forth. And the books did an amazing job at teaching what I call the superficial side of history. Names and dates and what battle happened when, and memorize all the things for the quiz that you're immediately going to forget because it's not relevant to your life. However, the books all miserably failed, all of them, when it came to teaching kids the ideas of the past. So we all know this quote, those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. But that quote is about the ideas. Those who don't learn from the past, we have to kind of have this philosophical or conceptual analysis of what happened and then apply it to our day. These books barely even attempt that. At best they say, well, they were all upset over no taxation without representation. Okay, like, sure, true. I mean, yes, but it's like the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. And it's the reduction of the entire American Revolution to one talking point. It was far more nuanced and complex than that. So Elijah and I felt like, he's my partner, the illustrator, we felt like we needed to teach American history through the lens of liberty through the lens of the ideas, focusing not just on what happened, but why it happened, and more importantly, how it applies to our world today, how it can help an 8-year-old reading this book to have a better life and make a better world. And these history books don't do any of that at all. It's like, here's these random factoids that you should learn, but that's completely irrelevant. And frankly, I think, I'll put my tinfoil hat on here, I think this is all intentional. I think that dumbing down curriculum, reducing the powerful ideas of our past to silly little talking points and factoids to memorize, I think this is intentional. I think there are many people out there who want to discard the kind of classical liberal heritage of America's founding, and by teaching history while completely eliminating the, I mean, it's like the cafeteria food at schools, right? Sure, here's calories, kid, but you're going to become obese by eating this horrible cafeteria food. It's not nutritious, despite Michelle Obama's attempt to supposedly try and fix that. And so that to me is the kind of nutrition equivalent of the political and economic education that kids are getting today, where it's like empty calories. It's like, memorize this crap, but it won't nourish you and it won't help you thrive in your own life. So that's what the new book is about, trying to not just teach the what of the past, but the why and how it applies to our lives today.
That's awesome. No, I love that, because I remember when I first started getting exposed to the ideas later in life, in my early 20s, it made me reflect on exactly the points you made, where it's like, what did I even learn in history? I remember names and places, and I don't even remember the dates. I only remembered them for the test, but I couldn't have explained to you what the political philosophy behind the founding of the country was. I couldn't explain what the economic makeup of the country was supposed to be, and all these ideas that last way longer than just the events. And I never would have been able to explain any of that. And no one I talk to, frankly, today that has gone through the standard public education system can do that either. It's all very foreign to them. Or if they are familiar with any of the ideas like capitalism or anything, it's because it's been presented to them post their public education in a form of social media and other ways that are just, like you said, it's presented as inherently oppressive and destructive and just bad. And so yeah. I've really been a fan of seeing this work come out. And speaking of history, you do a lot of interviews and you talk about this a lot with different people on different podcasts, or you were just at Freedom Fest talking about some of this stuff. But there's a different part of history I wanted to cover with you, because I also am interested in your perspective as being an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, while also being a very outspoken political activist and someone who gets involved in helping make sure that liberty is spread not only nationwide but especially here in Utah. And I didn't even plan for this, but this weekend is the 24th of July, which for Mormons is a very special holiday, and we call it Pioneer Day. And so I mean there's a significance to it for everybody, but I suspect that for you probably look at it in a different context or a different light of things, given your political inclinations and the way that through which you view the world. Is that accurate?
It's probably accurate. Most people, Pioneer Day has just become, most Mormons, members of our church, Pioneer Day is like a second 4th of July. It's another excuse to shoot fireworks and hang out with the family. It is a holiday devoid of much substance, much like Independence Day. We now call it the 4th of July. I mean, can you imagine Christians rioting if we as a society collectively decide to say Merry 25th of December, right? Like instead of Merry Christmas, like to not call it Independence Day is just a further kind of deviation or dilution of the power of remembering. I mean, that's the point of these holidays, is to remember the past and then apply that learning to our present. And to not even mention the word independence,
right,
in the name is ridiculous. So with Pioneer Day, okay, great, yay, pioneers! But like the actual circumstances behind the holiday are far more relevant for our lives today. And to your point, David, yes, there are political implications. I mean, why did the Mormon pioneers embark on their journey? Well, it's because all the local people who lived around them in Illinois, Missouri, and all these different places were persecuting them, were killing them, were tarring and feathering them, which was, I'm glad we don't have that form of punishment anymore. Stringing them up in the public square, burning their homes, and the local sheriffs and the magistrates would often turn a blind eye. The government that was formed to protect and secure their rights was failing them repeatedly. And then you have to ask, okay, is it just like Mormons good, neighbors evil, whatever? Or is there something to learn there? Well, why were the locals so pissed off? They were so concerned because all these Mormons from around the world are emigrating and moving into a very concentrated political unit in Nauvoo and other places. And the neighbors are like, wait a minute, are we gonna have a Mormon sheriff in our county and a Mormon judge and a Mormon this, that, and the other? And they viewed it as a kind of political threat where these people were going to take over their government. And that was a concern to them. I'm not saying it was justified, but that was the basis of their concern, was the dominance of Mormon population in the area and the political ramifications of that concentration of Mormons in one small area. And so they attacked and they persecuted and killed Joseph Smith. The circumstances that led up to his death were wrapped up in that. And so now the leader of the founder of the church is assassinated. And so the church members basically decide to get out of Dodge, most of them. There were some that stayed, but the vast majority fled west to come to what is now Utah. They basically left the United States of America because at the time Utah was not, one of the states, and they leave the United States. Then the Spanish-American War happens. So now the Utah Territory is part of the territories that the states now own because they took it from Spain. And so now they become a territory, then they become a state. But the point is that, our heritage in our church is that one of government mistrust, one of failures of, political systems to protect our rights, one of persecution and actual victimhood, not the pretend kind that, social justice warriors like to claim the mantle of today. And a reminder, I think a stark reminder that what we believe and when we work together is a threat to other people, and we have to be prepared for that. We have to recognize that. And to me, then it creates lessons for today. In other words, it's not just say, let's remember what happened to pioneers. It's like, okay, well, if we were living out our faith and if we were kind of organizing and working together, and, that could be a threat. Maybe it is a threat, active, present threat to other people. And how are we going to handle that? Do we lavishly praise the government and become an ingrained part of it? Or do we have a bit of arm's length skepticism to say, you failed us once, you may fail us again. And so let's not rely upon and depend upon you, the state, for our security and for our, safety. Maybe we ought to take matters into our own hands. Maybe we should be more judicious. So it is a holiday that's rich with kind of political strife and these consequences. But again, for most people, it's like, yay, more fireworks. And that's really all it's devolved into.
Yeah, it's a 4th of July part 2, but
Mhm.
and it's interesting because you actually have written 3 books. I mean, you've written countless books, but you've written 3 books in particular, kind of, I guess you could say, marrying this political philosophy that you hold with your faith. And the most recent one you just did was called Christ versus Caesar, where you really harp on this point, like you were just alluding to, where it's like, we have the state and then we have our institution. And is the state really something that's, should be trusted? Is it something that, is friendly to us? But you even take it further back with the scripture of when Jesus Christ said, give unto Caesar, render unto Caesar what is unto Caesar's, and render unto God's what is God's. And you wrote an entire book, like really diving into that point. Can you maybe elaborate, because I think there's some really serious, I mean, it's one thing to think, okay, there's some things that belong to the state or the government or, earthly things, and then the other things belong to God. But as you read the book and you really think about what the implications of Christ's words were, I feel like there's some pretty deep results or outcomes, you could say, that people maybe overlook or aren't necessarily thinking about. Do you want to explain a little bit on what your focus was there?
Yeah, my first book a decade ago was Latter-day Liberty, and that was my attempt to kind of explain how the gospel of Jesus Christ relates to kind of political type of matters. And at the time, I was, I guess, what you would call a minarchist. someone who believes in a limited government, constitutional restraint, as I think it was or maybe it was Madison said. Actually, no, it was Jefferson. Chain the government down by the Constitution. We'll have these like limits. Of course, I think it was Madison who called the Constitution a parchment barrier if the people weren't believing the ideas and actually supporting these things. So that's where I was in life about a decade ago. Where I'm at now, people say, what's your political affiliation? I'll say a variety of things. Sometimes I'll say, oh, I'm Christian, and they're like, I didn't ask your religious affiliation. I asked your I'm like, well, same thing for me. Or sometimes I'll say I'm a voluntarist. I never use the word anarchist. I think that word is far too loaded, and people imagine Connor throwing Molotov cocktails up at Capitol Hill. Because I don't think the word conveys a lot, and it has a lot of negative connotations. But I'll say voluntarist because people like voluntary, like what? And I think all human interaction should be voluntary. And oh yeah, me too. And I'm like, well,
Yeah,
like, do you really? But let's talk about that. Or sometimes I'll say I'm a follower of the way. And then I'll have no clue what I'm talking about, and then that gives me an opportunity to explain what that is, which I mentioned in the book. So the book was written a couple years ago, more at this progression of my understanding, and that is that the state is inherently evil. There's no moral or ethical justification for its existence, that it exists to oppress, that it is the institutionalization of what Frederick Bastiat once wrote about how people like to use the government to live at the expense of everyone else. It is the weaponization of greed and envy, by which people try and force other people to subsidize their lifestyle and pay for them. It is the implementation of the exact opposite of the golden rule. We would never think to do directly to our neighbors what we indirectly do to them through the state. So from a Christian gospel standpoint, I believe Caesar, this generic term for the state, not just Julius Caesar or Augustus or one of the ancient Caesars, but this idea of mortal rule by men over others, I believe is desire to kind of oppress and lure people into stealing from one another and harming them and controlling them and basically violating God's top commandment to love one another. You cannot love one another through Caesar, through the state. All you can do is the exact opposite, and that is what is done on a daily basis. So as I look at what Satan wants to do and has said he wants to do and is doing, and what the scriptures talk about what his role is on the earth, and for those of us who are Mormons, we go to the temple, and there's kind of some temple ceremonies there where different things are taught that have some relation to this as well, about Satan's desire to kind of control people through the political process. All of that tied together, I feel like, well, the state is doing exactly what Satan is trying to do. Therefore, Caesar is kind of the mortal arm and extension of Satan. And so for those of us who are Christian and want to love one another and do good to one another, we cannot do that through the state. There's just no way to do it, and it is the exact opposite. So anyways, the book was kind of an attempt to kind of look at scripture through the lens of if we really tried to listen to Jesus and to what he actually said, not what we think he said, not what we learned in Sunday school, the kind of simplistic version, the convenient version of what he said, right? Oh yeah, like we're going to interpret it this way. If we actually take these things at face value, as many of the early Christians did. I mean, they were, for the most part of them, pacifists. They really took seriously this idea to love one another, and to, turn the other cheek and all these types of things. So if we really listen to Jesus, there's some huge political ramifications to doing that, to being a follower of the way, to actually doing what he said. And so the book was an attempt to kind of say, what would that look like? For me, it was more of an intellectual curiosity for myself, as it was wanting to, like, I have all the answers and I'm going to go teach everyone. It was more, I had that question and I wanted to go discover like what that would actually look like. And hey, if I'm going to go do all that research, might as well share it with other people. And thus the book was born.
Yeah. Well, it's a great book. I enjoyed it. I think I have like one chapter left, but I think you did a great job, like elaborating on those points and really bringing up, even for someone who doesn't fully agree, like it presents a really well thought out and good argument just to get those gears turning in their head and think, okay, well, maybe if I don't agree with this, why? There's some good
Mm.
points to be made. Now, it's so weird to me because when I started to embark on this journey of, learning about the political philosophy of, liberty, and, or if you want to call it libertarianism or whatever, just about freedom and what inspired a lot of the founding of this country, I found that because I was raised in the church, I was raised a member here in Utah, and I found there was a lot of parallels, and it was very interesting. And like you were explaining earlier, the history of the church, a lot of that comes from, like, there's this antagonism from the state against the members, and the church was persecuted very heavily. And as we review some of the scriptures that are like very important and taught in church, there's a deeper lesson that I think revolves around, like what you're saying, voluntarism. I mean, people like to talk about, well, Jesus would have been a Democrat, Jesus would have been a Republican. I think Jesus would have been a voluntarist because that was the whole essence of the gospel. But what's weird to me is I feel like there's a lot of people I've talked to who, if they've even learned a little bit about these two subjects, it's interesting because it feels like today, modern day, the Mormonism and the way that Utah politics runs, it seems like there isn't really a strong foothold in those roots of like being anti or distrustful of the state. Not necessarily, you have to be anti and hate the government, be an anarchist or voluntarist to that degree, but it doesn't seem like there's that spirit. I mean, you had Joseph Smith, one of his quotes that I didn't even know about till later in life in the last couple of years was, teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. And you had like some of these principles and early leaders that really focused on a lot of these like deeper freedom issues. But today it doesn't seem like that. And I would say, and I don't know how you would interpret, today's political climate in Utah. I would have imagined Utah being a much more, I guess, like free state, as far as like if the gospel and the members are supposed to be practicing, bringing people to Christ and voluntarily getting them to choose. It doesn't really seem like a lot of the laws are geared that way. How do you think that we've got there, or do you agree with that assessment?
I totally agree with that assessment. And I remember when I wrote my first book that basically makes the case that you just did. Like, hey, Mormons, like you're not living out your faith. Like people put their religion in a bucket. It's like, here's my church bucket. And I look into that bucket on Sunday. I fill it up, I use it, whatever. And then here's my political bucket. Here's my work bucket. Here's my hobby bucket. But they're all separate buckets of life. And that's, I don't think, the proper expression of the Christian faith. I think it permeates or ought to permeate your life. And so when I wrote this first book, it was like, hey, Mormons, like there's actually like political implications of being a Mormon. Here's what I think they are. Let's talk about it. And at the time, this was 2011 when I wrote the book. So Mitt Romney was already running for president in the 2012 race. And everyone's all a buzz, again, he had run, 4 years prior, but everyone's like, oh, a Mormon in the White House, and imagine a holder of the priesthood and someone who has the Holy Ghost, and, how cool would that be, and all these things. And I remember being on C-SPAN. They have a program called Book TV. So they were interviewing me about my book, Latter-day Liberty. And the host asked me, this question, like, well, Mitt Romney's Mormon, right? Isn't that what, like Mormon politics looks like? I'm like, oh my gosh, like, no way, right? Because here's someone like Mitt Romney, who I think he's just a technocrat, politician who just, does what he thinks is expedient and sounds good or whatever. But he's not someone, I think, at all. If you look at his whole political record, there's no evidence at all that he has guided in his, maybe in some superficial sense, like on abortion, right? Or like one of the easy ones, but not when it comes to like taxation, right? Or, guns, or like any of these, like when he was governor of Massachusetts. So I just think that for most members of our church, they don't think at all about how their faith implicates what they should do at the ballot box, or the things that they should watch, or the things that they should read, or the things that they should support and believe in. It's just like, oh, I believe these religious things over here, and then, oh, here's this current event happening. Oh, I can believe whatever I want when it comes to that. What do my friends think? Maybe I'll agree with them, and there's no kind of common thread between their supposed faith and all of these different decisions that they make. It's just not a way that a lot of people think. They're not kind of taught to think that way. I don't think our culture supports mixing church and politics, quote unquote. If anything, I think the culture supports quite the opposite, right? Keep them separate. Don't bring that up in Sunday school. Too controversial. Don't talk about that, And I think that cultural approach leads to this chasm between political matters and so-called religious matters, when I see them as inherently intertwined. Why? Because both of them have to do with how we interact with our fellow man. Both of them. Religion is like, how do I show love to God? By loving other people, by going out and serving them, by helping them, supporting them. To your point, David, the kind of charitable actions that we ought to see, right? And politics, it's all about how we interact in society with our neighbors and among community members, and between property owners, neighbors, and all these interactions. They both have to do with how we interact with one another. Why in the world would we separate them? And unfortunately, our culture just is not there. And that's, I think, in part what I'm trying to do is try and raise a bit of a warning flag and say, knock it off. We got to talk about how they relate together, not about keeping them totally separate.
Right. Yeah. Whenever I talk to friends that aren't members, or who, are ex-members or whatever, a lot of them think of, the church is leading the way, like they're the ones that are governing our politics in Utah, when in reality, because, Mormons don't drink and our alcohol laws are super strict. But in reality, when you evaluate the principles and the teachings, it shouldn't be. That's like the literal opposite. Like you said, it's not at all the way that Utah should approach things, or I guess members of this faith should approach things. Now, you have a really interesting perspective because, as mentioned earlier, you are the president of a think tank in Utah. So, that organization has been for years fighting a lot of these laws, or making sure that, people's individual liberties aren't violated by the state, making sure that, if their doors are not getting kicked down by police and no-knock raids. Or I would say one of the biggest ones, the most significant changes that we've had in Utah was the change of marijuana laws, which I think came to a big surprise for a lot of people, thinking that Utah would legalize medical marijuana. And it's interesting because you, again, are you're an active member and you're happy to share that and you're very open about it. But who was one of the number one opponents that was pushing back on your guys's attempt to change this law?
Well, one of them, I would say that the one that you're asking about is not just one of them. It is the top in terms of political power and resources and influence. It was, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. President Nelson, who leads the church right now, he used to be the president of the Utah Medical Association, which also opposed our effort. He grew up in this pharmaceutical world, right? And so, marijuana, no, that's just a drug. It can't be dispensed. It's not FDA approved. And that's the type of mindset that I think he has or had, and certainly a lot of other people as well. And that was a very interesting period for me, because I found myself leading the effort against many opponents, many powerful opponents. I mean, the whole legislature, the governor's office, the law enforcement community, PTA, the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, you name it. Like any group, like it was my David and Goliath moment. It was, man, it was crazy, and so there was a ton of opposition, but it was a very interesting pickle to have the church be the ringleader in the opposition, because I'm a member of the church. I remember they had their law firm, Curtin McConkie, issue an analysis of Prop 2, the ballot proposition that we had put together. And so they come out with this legal memo. analyzing the proposition, in their estimation, why it was bad. And this was an effort to put it out there to the public and say, don't vote for this thing, it's bad. It was, I'm not a lawyer. I pretend to be a lawyer. I can do a lot of things lawyers can do. I sit in rooms full of lawyers all the time, and I tell them, I don't have the school debt that you do, but I can still do a lot of what you do, playfully. But but I'm not a lawyer, right? So with that qualifier, I'm reading this legal memo, and I'm just appalled at the quality of the arguments. So I sent it to some lawyer friends. I was like, am I wrong here? And they were like, that's the worst pile of garbage I've ever read. Like the common opinion from attorneys that I circulated it to was that an intern had written it at the law firm, because no one else wanted to like be associated with it. So they had the intern, the law school intern who had like a year or two of law school, just because it was so weak. And yet this is what the church stood by. So they issue this memo. And I'm reading this thing like, this is garbage. Everyone I'm talking to agrees it's garbage. I'm going to write a response. So within 24 hours, I had put together this 5-page response where I take each of their little arguments and I poke holes in them. I'm like, you're wrong here, this is misrepresenting it, this is off base, you're not seeing this other part of the bill where that part is addressed. And so I issue this on Libertas letterhead, and I had the team kind of review it, but we put this out, and I think it said a rebuttal to the Curtin McConkie memo. So then like a week later or whatever, they put out another one. And the subject line was a rebuttal to the rebuttal of the Curtin McConkie legal. So here's the church through its legal arm, basically trying to attack what we're doing. And of course, I'm getting accusations from all kinds of people that I'm, not supporting the brethren, and I'm weakening people's testimony, and I'm speaking ill of the Lord's anointed, and all these things. And I'm, not following the brethren. And what was very interesting to me, though, is that I also got a ton of support from people that I did not expect. You typically expect kind of the left-leaning, progressive type people who are finding their way out of the church to, already be in that direction and take issue with something like this. That would shock precisely no one. What surprised me was staunchly conservative, politically and socially conservative, ardent members of the faith who, for example, and I have many, but for example, their grandma has arthritis, and she used cannabis to rub on her knuckles at night to reduce the pain. And so here's this ardent member of the church who loves their grandma and is saying that this helps grandma, doesn't hurt anyone else, and now the church is fighting it. So all these conservative people who supported our efforts to legalize medical cannabis because they are someone they loved, was using or wanted to use it. And now the church is saying no. And so all these church members are struggling in their testimony, wondering what the hell is going on. Why is my church fighting against this? Connor, please help. I don't understand. I've never been conflicted like this before, et cetera, et cetera. And so on the one hand, I'm being called an apostate. On the other hand, I'm being sought after as a counselor in a sense to help these people navigate a faith crisis and understand why would the church do this. To which I would have to tell them, you just took the red pill apparently, because now you get to learn about all the historical examples where the church has been doing stuff like this. But it was a first in the sense that this is the first time that the church had ever pushed people to take a political action via email. They emailed all the members of the church in Utah and said, here's this legal memo. Don't vote for Prop 2. We think this is bad, et cetera. It came under the signature of the area president, Craig C. Christensen, and on church little, letterhead, logo, everything official. But here they are doing this email blast out to everyone. They had never done that before. That was the kind of first. And so, of course, I'm like the tip of the spear on a lot of this, and I'm an active member of the church, and I'm getting it from both sides. And then later we went into negotiations with the church's representative, and before any of that started, I was in a room with Senator Madsen when we were trying to on Capitol Hill get a bill passed before we did the initiative. And I'm sitting in the room. It's me and Senator Madsen and his intern, and then the two government affairs representatives from the church, who on the Hill everyone would affectionately call the home teachers. So the home teachers are here to visit, basically tell us what the church wants. And they're sitting in the room to tell us that they're there to basically kill the bill. that they were going to go meet with the Speaker of the House and the Senate President and say, we don't want this bill. Church opposes this, which in Utah is, death knell, because all these people who consider that the word of God are not going to vote to support it. So I found myself in a very interesting situation. I navigated it fine. Like, I'm still an active member of the church, and I can compartmentalize and do compartmentalize the kind of bureaucratic man-made decisions and corruptions and biases and stuff that all human individuals have. And, the at times inspired, actions and statements and teachings of these individuals. But for a lot of people, that's hard. They have an all or nothing kind of approach. They think, they're either prophetic all the time or they're not. To Joseph Smith, you mentioned earlier the quote where he says, teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. Another one is he says, a prophet is only a prophet when acting as such. And when he's eating his Wheaties in the morning, should we all eat Wheaties? Is everything? Well, no, of course not. So we have to learn the nuance. We have to discern. We have to, and even if something is said over the pulpit, how many things have been said over the pulpit in decades and centuries past that are now, renounced or pushed down the memory hole? So not everything that's said over the pulpit is prophetic, even if it comes from the president of the church. So that requires a lot of effort. And that, I think, is why a lot of members of the church struggle. It is far easier to just assume and act upon this idea that whatever he says is what God wants me to do. So I'm not going to do my own thinking and analysis and pray and struggle. I'm just going to do what he says. And I think that's spiritually lazy, but it's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder how much of it comes from, as we were talking at the very beginning about the education system. I mean, people are not raised and taught in public education to really think and evaluate and really go through the process of, understanding why they believe something or why something is the way it is. You're just kind of spoon fed all this information and just go along with life and just say yes, okay, or get the test right and just know enough to get by. And I mean, that definitely is the experience I've had with people I know, members of the church. And, I've really enjoyed, you've been doing, I don't know if you're still doing them, but you've been doing Sunday musings to kind of go through this mental exercise for people, help them go cover certain topics where it's like, okay, what's something that we do traditionally or culturally in the church? What we're always doing XYZ thing. Is that really something that comes from doctrine? Is it something that really the church was the gospel of Christ was founded on? Or is this just something that somehow got married into the culture of Mormonism? And so there's a couple I thought would be fun to, as we're wrapping up, we've got a few minutes left, maybe just kind of quickly cover some of those, and you can give a little bit of a taste for people on how you view certain issues.
Sure.
I think one of my favorites, because to me, I have such a hard problem with the empire status of our country and this whole nationalist type of behavior. And you cover a little bit on why you don't pledge allegiance to a flag, how you've had the way, because of how you practice the way, following Christ and upholding his doctrine, that actually has implications for you as to why you don't support certain things, like marrying this patriotism, nationalism into church things. You want to maybe explain a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's very easy for us to look at Israel and think how ridiculous they were. How could you worship a golden calf? Moses is up in the mountain communing with God. You're waiting for him to give kind of the next direction. And you can't just hold on a little longer. You're worshiping a golden calf. I mean, really? How stupid do you have to? So it's very easy for us to do that. And I think that's kind of the conventional reaction to the children of Israel and their constant idolatrous temptations. But I look at that and I say, well, hold up. There's probably a lesson there. And if we ask the question to ourselves, how are we idolatrous? I think we get some interesting answers if we're open and sincere in asking that question, because I think we have a lot of sacred cows as well that people would not want to consider idolatrous. And
Oh yeah.
chief among them is this kind of nationalist identity where we kind of worship the state. We are more infatuated with our identity as Americans than we are as Christians, as disciples of Christ. God's family is not carved into arbitrary lines. We are as much brothers and sisters with, Iraqis and folks down in Venezuela and, all the folks in North Korea, and, than we are the, guy over here in Provo, right? That we're all brothers and sisters. And so the commandment is not to love those of your tribe, it is to love one another. And of course, the Jews struggled with this, right? The apostles struggled with, wait, we have to go preach the gospel to other people? Wait, you're talking to Samaritans? Don't you know what they've done? Don't you know what their ancestors did? And they struggled. And we read these stories and we think, you're all idiots. And we do the same thing. And so, I think going back to our conversation about Christ versus Caesar, and how Caesar, I think, is this manifestation of Satan. Ultimately, what was Satan wanting to do? He was wanting to counterfeit Christ. He wanted the power, he wanted the glory, he wanted to kind of be the savior. And so is it any wonder that Caesar has all kinds of counterfeits for Christ's gospel? I mean, Caesar has temples, Caesar has scripture, right? Your textbooks and official documents like the Constitution. It has catechisms like the Pledge, repeat these prayers and these things. It has seminaries of learning, right? These government schools to indoctrinate the young in the kind of ways of this secular humanist religion. It has its priests, it has its robes, it has all these things that are traditionally associated with the church broadly speaking, not just our modern church, and so these are all substitutions, and ones that we readily adopt. I think the worst one, of course, is the militarization, the what the scriptures call relying upon the arm of flesh, trying to seek salvation and protection through mortal means rather than relying upon God. And one of the best things he ever said, I think, was when Spencer W. Kimball, he wrote in this article. It was back in the 70s, I believe. They were doing like missile testing and stuff here in Utah, so he was kind of reacting to that. And he talked about how we meaning members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that think that we're like super Christian, better than all the Christians. And he said that we worship false gods of stone and steel, and that rather training people up to be disciples of Christ and build God's kingdom, we're building a false kingdom. We're building Caesar's kingdom. We're training, instead of building up followers of the Prince of Peace, we train a man to act in war and consider him a patriot, counterfeiting, he says, the words of Jesus, which say, right, to love one another, to forgive your enemies, to turn the other cheek, and all these things. So to me, that's idolatry, to basically see salvation. I mean, because why did the children of Israel worship a golden calf? They wanted direction, they wanted food, they wanted to know what to do. They depended upon these mystical, they come from Egypt, they had all these gods and everything, and they were ascribing to those gods their salvation. Oh, if I just say this type of prayer, my day will go better, my crops will do better. Let me do this chant and click my heels a few times and say thank you to this random god. And so they'd grown up in that culture, and here they were again, like, oh, we're in the desert, I want to have a good day, I don't want to get sunburned, I want food, I want, let's hope that this calf will do. Well, we do the same thing, right? Government programs and military spending and politicians and all these mortal organizations and individuals that offer themselves as our mortal salvation. We will help you, we will take care of you, we will save you, we will provide for you. And so we are doing exactly what the children of Israel did. I think in a lot of cases worse.
Oh yeah.
And perhaps in no greater instance is that manifested in the visceral reaction people have to pledging allegiance to the flag. Like when I ran to be a delegate in this last process, just for kicks. I mean, whatever. I show up. I'm a good little, political activist. I go to my caucus meeting and no one else is running, so I stand up. Like, okay, fine. I'll do it again. And this guy during the Q&A period, he's like, I want to ask a question of Mr. Boyack. I was like, all right, here we go. And he says, I want to know why you didn't stand and pledge allegiance earlier in the program. And there's like 40, 50 people here. And these are my neighbors, people in my local community, And I was like, hey, thanks for the opportunity to clarify. I believe it's idolatry. I'm a very patriotic person in terms of the ideas of freedom. And I have a job in an organization and books and all these things demonstrated how much I value and what I'm trying to do. But I don't believe it's proper to pledge allegiance to a piece of cloth or to a government. I pledge allegiance to God. And if you look at the history of the Pledge of Allegiance, it was written by a socialist, atheist, secular humanist who did not want to promote patriotism. He wanted to promote subservience to the state. And those are not, and my two children were present, by the way, for this whole thing. They were sitting at the table. And so those aren't things that I teach to my kids. And I don't believe they're true American values. I don't believe they're true patriotic values. And so I respectfully abstain from saying the Pledge of Allegiance because I don't believe its author and I are aligned ideologically. And I don't believe we should be pledging allegiance to a flag or to a government. And like grumble response. But that is the problem, is that we are so idolatrous, and it's worse to for people like that, it's worse to not pledge allegiance to the flag than it is to not say your prayers or something religious, right? It's like, oh, no big deal, oh, you didn't pledge allegiance to the flag, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
And that to me is the perfect indication of how idolatrous we've become.
Yeah, I mean, you even give him the he's probably expecting some I hate America answer, and it's like, no, it's because I love God so much. You out Christianed him. He was like,
does not compute.
Ridiculous. Well, so last question. What would your how do you think Joseph Smith would react if he could see the current situation with how a lot of members and this climate, kind of everything we've talked about, with the idolatrousness and kind of seeming to miss the mark on a lot of things. What do you think Joseph Smith's reaction would be if he saw all of this in today?
I don't think he'd be surprised. I think he'd be disappointed, but I don't think he'd be surprised. And he has this quote where he's talking about trying to teach the members of the church all these revelations he's having, all these grandiose visions and teachings and everything. And he says, I'll get this mostly right. He says, as soon as I try and teach a new revealed principle to the saints, no sooner do they fly to pieces like glass. He struggled over and over again to get the saints. He's there in front of them. They're following this guy for a reason. He's having these amazing visions. He created this Book of Mormon, this ignorant little farm kid. There's no other plausible explanation for this, the existence of this thing and how complex and amazing this book is. And it's attracting all these people, and they're there with him, and he's having more revelations and all these things, right? And despite all of that, and then he's healing people, just all kinds of stuff. and despite him being there, he's then introducing a new revelation or a new teaching or a new principle that goes against the cultural, tradition, whatever. And the people, and they resist, and they corrupt it. They try and, appease that teaching with this other teaching that they had in their old church or whatever, and try and mix the two. And so he's struggling, and he's seeing that the saints are really struggling to do what he's telling them to and what they ought to do. And so for Joseph to kind of, poof, here he is today, looking around, seeing how, I'd say, degraded we are in our spirituality, how spiritually apathetic the saints are, how disconnected we are from a lot of the revelations that he gave and their potency and everything. I think he would recognize that, that is the cumulative byproduct of 200 centuries or 200 years, of what he witnessed in just 2 decades or less, rather, decade and a half of his ministry, I don't think he'd be surprised. I think he experienced this condensed version of what we've seen over the span of 2 centuries, and it makes me wonder. In Doctrine and Covenants 1, it talks about this was a revelation later given after many of the other revelations had been received, and the Lord gave this revelation as kind of the intended preface for what was then called the Book of Commandments, this compilation of these revelations. And in fact, I'm not going to do it justice, and so I'm going to pull up and read these couple of verses, because it talks in here about the problem that I think Joseph was experiencing, and what he was trying to react to. So this is D&C 1, and it's talking about the period of time in which the restoration was happening. This is verses 14 through 17. It says, "And the arm of the Lord shall be revealed, and the day cometh that they who will not hear the voice of the Lord, neither the voice of his servants, neither give heed to the words of the prophets and apostles, shall be cut off from among the people. For they have strayed from mine ordinances, and have broken mine everlasting covenant. They seek not the Lord to establish his righteousness, but every man walketh in his own way, and after the image of his own God, whose image is in the likeness of the world, and whose substance is that of an idol, which waxeth old and shall perish in Babylon. Wherefore I, the Lord, knowing the calamity which should come upon the inhabitants of the earth, called upon my servant Joseph Smith and spake unto him from heaven and gave him commandments." So it's saying that, all right, like, we have this great apostasy idea. Everyone's kind of doing whatever they want, have their own ideas, idolatry everywhere. What we would call today speaking their truth. You speak your truth. I'll speak my. Everything's subjective. There's nothing objective. And so the Lord is like, all right, I've had it. I'm calling Joseph. We're going to reveal truth. We're going to get the ship righted. And so he tried, and he does all these things, revelations, trying to teach all these things. And so we kind of had this like degrading of spirituality. And then Joseph comes. We have all these revelations, an amazing thing. And then I think we've been degrading ever since. So I don't think Joseph would be shocked. I think he would recognize that, I guess, human nature is what it is, and that despite the Lord's attempt, people have agency as to whether they will follow and adhere to it, or be seduced like the Israelites were, and by all the surrounding culture and the other kind of religious influences and the secularism and all the things. I think Joseph would be very disappointed. I think he would not recognize the church today. There have been many changes and things like that. But I think he would recognize that we have strayed a lot from what he tried to do. I think he would maybe wash his hands a little bit and say, like, well, I fulfilled my, calling, and the rest is up to everyone else to have their agency, what they're going to do. It would be fascinating, I think, to have Joseph, resurrected Joseph Smith, stand up at the pulpit for a general conference and teach. Not these little 5-minute talks that they do, but like they used to do in the early days, right? For like 2 hours, just lay into it and expound. That would be fascinating. I don't know. That's a fun kind of mental thought of WWJD. What would Joseph do?
Yeah.
It's, I don't know. It's just fun to think about.
Yeah, I had that question pop up right before we started this. I was thinking, like, yeah, after everything we talk about, it would be interesting to just think, what would his reaction be? Because I feel similar. It would be something akin to that, where it's like, yeah, what do you do at that point? He's definitely done his part, and you can't stop people from doing what they're going to do. So, well, I know you have a hard stop, so why don't you go ahead and just plug away where people can find your work, if they're interested in following what you're doing, and then we'll just wrap up with that.
Awesome. Thanks, David. So if you're interested in the Tuttle Twins, which we talked about earlier, that's at TuttleTwins.com, or on all the social channels. We have spicy memes that we share on Instagram, so make sure to follow us there. If you're interested in following our work at Libertas Institute, that's at libertas.org. And that's where we talk about kind of our political work in Utah and across the country. And then, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can subscribe to Sunday Musings if you're at all Mormon or Christian background, try and talk about kind of more inclusive topics as well, not just for the Mormons among us. Or if you're looking for me, I'm very easy to find on social media. So feel free to reach out or follow me. Yeah. So anyways, I just appreciate again being able to join you here and share some of these thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you for taking the time. It was great. I hope that this has opened the door for a lot of people. I mean, I try to focus on Utah and have Utah audience. So I'm hoping that this reaches people who haven't considered these things or necessarily been familiar with your work. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank
Connie.
you.
Yep. Well, I'll see everyone next time.